Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. We do have our discussion opener question on the screen. For those who were not with us last week, this is how we begin our video chat session, is we post a question and we ask for your input. And this is an open, relaxed, it's not formal. It's an informal conversation that we have one another to raise your thoughts and responses in relation to that question. So today we're going to be discussing a scenario that you may or may not have come across yet, but if you haven't, think about it. Think about when you are contacted by a local family member who pleads with you to help their relative who had to flee their home and is in a desperate situation. How would you respond to that person asking for your help? Well, this has been great information sharing. Hopefully you have heard something maybe that you hadn't considered before, or maybe you have, and that's good news. It means that you've thought deeply about this conversation already. I'm just going to summarize quickly some of the things that we have heard from you today, in case somebody joined us a little bit late. So when you are contacted by a local family member here in Canada who pleads with you to help their relative who had to flee their home and is in a desperate situation, many of you said that you would look to yourselves initially to consider whether you can actually help. And some of the ways that you are considering is, do you have the time? Do you have the finances? Do you have the training and information that you need to be able to help them? You have also considered the person who is in a desperate situation as well. How can they be helped? Or how can their family in Canada be helped? And I heard a lot of you talk about emotional support, how important it is in those first conversations to let the person know that you are here to give them what you can, even if it is just guidance and information. And I also heard you say it's important to consider the details, the case-specific details about the person who had to flee. And some of the things you need to ask are, where are they? Are they still in their country of origin, or have they fled to a different country? Which country? I also heard you say, do they have the refugee status determination document or not? And to ask if they have sought the help and resources in the country of asylum if they have fled their own country. And I think the question we should also ask is this person in Canada that you're talking about? Because some people might just be calling who know nothing about private sponsorship and think, well, there's a program that the government has called private sponsorship, and there's people who can help refugees who come to Canada. But people who land in Canada, as you know, can't be privately sponsored. So it's important to clarify, are they outside of their country of origin, and are they here in Canada, or are they in a different country? And making use of those supports and resources where they are now is vitally important to help their sense of well-being and feeling like they're able to do for themselves in a situation where they feel like they're out of control right now. And one of those ways is by contacting the United Nations, UNHCR, in the country of asylum. And those of you who have been taking this course are aware now that UNHCR has web pages for every country that they are working in with instructions and directions for how to seek asylum and to get refugee status in that country. And so you would search UNHCR and put a comma in the Google search and type in the name of the asylum country where the person is. And it should call up a UNHCR page to give you more details about that registration process and how to obtain protection in that country. And I think what I also heard was asking that family who their connections are and how they might be able to work with other family members in Canada to raise enough funds and to be a partner in privately sponsoring that family member. And you could even offer your services to guide them in completing the application, as one person said. But it is important to think about the emotional state that that person is in. They're desperate, as are the people who are overseas. And many of you shared, you know that experience. You've lived it, both as a refugee coming to Canada, but also as somebody who has sponsored other people here in Canada. And so letting them know that you understand where they're at, vitally important. But for some of us, we haven't done sponsorship before. We don't know what it's like to live as a refugee in another country. We don't know what it's like yet to be a private sponsor, because that's why we're here. That's why we're taking this course. And that's okay. Glean from the knowledge and experience of your classmates, and you'll learn. We'll learn together. So thank you so much for joining in this conversation. So moving along, I am going to review Module 2. We just finished Module 2 last week. You should be starting Module 3 this week, but we'll go over the key points from Module 2 today. So in Module 2, you learned about the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which is Canada's legal framework for the policies, process, and protection of refugees from abroad, and those who make a refugee claim from within Canada. And there are 3 major objectives of the IRPA, and they are the economic development of Canada, uniting families, and protecting refugees. In this module, you also learned the different classes or streams of immigration to Canada, such as the economic class, the family class, and the refugee and humanitarian class. The PSR program, or the Private Sponsorship of Refugees program, is part of this last category, refugee and humanitarian class. And you also learned that Canada sets annual targets for immigration, which limit the number of persons who can settle to Canada under each category. Now, the partners in resettlement. The Canadian government works with referral partners to resettle refugees to Canada. So let's review the key actors and programs that are a part of Canada's refugee and humanitarian resettlement category. So one of the key players, of course, in the resettlement of refugees to Canada is the Government of Canada, who facilitates its immigration programs through the Department of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, also known as IRCC. As you are aware now, there are 2 different ways that refugees are referred to the government for inclusion in Canada's refugee class immigration stream. One of them is the referral from the United Nations High Commission for Refugees to the Canadian government for settlement of refugees under the Government Assisted Refugees Program. And the other is the referral from a group of private citizens, permanent residents, or status Indians to the Government of Canada for resettlement under the Private Sponsorship Program, which includes the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Partnership. Now, this is a special initiative for Canadians to support the resettlement of LGBTQ+ individuals. You might also remember that a portion of government-sponsored refugees may be matched with private sponsors who wish to assist in the resettlement of UNHCR-referred refugees through the Joint Assistance Sponsorship Program or the Blended Visa Office Referred Program. Now, I just want to add, we do have one other referral that happens, and it's for the Government Assisted Refugees Program. The Minister of Immigration has the authority to put out a provision, a ministerial provision, which offers resettlement opportunities for a one-time exemption to the immigration policies, which could allow a particular population to come to Canada quickly. We've seen this with the Afghan reporters, journalists, They were flown out of Afghanistan en masse on some planes as a last effort to get them out because they were under specific threat. We've also seen this with the Ukraine crisis that occurred where a temporary protection measure was put in place by Canada to allow Ukrainian nationals to come to Canada to seek refuge for a temporary period of time until it is safe for them to go back to Ukraine. And so that happens under the ministerial public policy. And those refugees are referred to the Canadian government in collaboration with UNHCR and some other referral partners who are on the ground. Module 2, you also learned about Canada's resettlement programs. So we're going to take a quick overview look at those. So please note that when we talk about these categories, we aren't speaking about the programs for refugees who are going to resettle in Quebec. Quebec has its own programs for sponsorship of refugees. Now, when we look at this chart, we're looking at 4 different areas. The first one is the type of support. Who is providing it? So on the left column, you'll see here, financial support is provided by. And so we're trying to determine whether it's by private sponsors, the government, or perhaps both. And the next category is who provides the settlement assistance? Is it private sponsors, the government of Canada, or both? And who were the referring partners? Was it private sponsors or the UNHCR? And the last category is, are the refugees typically known to their sponsors? So when we take a look at private sponsorship of refugees, in all categories, it is the private sponsors that are responsible for finances, settlement assistance. They are the referring partners, and the refugees are typically known to their sponsors. We do have, in many cases, a family link of some sort, or the sponsors have become aware of a particular refugee by name that they would like to sponsor. And so Canada's PSR program for a long time was the only one of its kind in the world in which private citizens could sponsor refugees. And in the past few years, however, taking cues from Canada, the international community has adopted similar programs in countries like the UK, Ireland, Spain, New Zealand, Argentina, and they were done through the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. In private sponsorships, as I mentioned, the financial support, settlement assistance from refugees comes from their private sponsors and not the government. For the most part, privately sponsored refugees have been chosen by the sponsors themselves. So, for example, a family member of a refugee who's living here in Canada, or perhaps an organization in Canada that has been made aware of a specific refugee or refugee family that they would like to sponsor. And in these cases, the sponsors refer these identified refugees for private sponsorship by submitting an application to Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. When it comes to the Blended Visa Office Referred Program, this is a cost-sharing program between the government and private sponsors. Private sponsors are responsible for startup costs and 6 months of financial support. The Government of Canada will cover the remaining 6 months of financial support. So it's a shared financial support commitment. The 12 months of settlement assistance, which includes social and emotional support, is provided by the private sponsors. Now, they may be working with organizations funded by the government called settlement agencies who provide some of those services, but it is the responsibility of the private sponsorship group to make sure that the refugees have access to those services. Now, keep in mind, you cannot refer a refugee to the BVOR program. The refugees who are eligible for this program are identified by the UNHCR only. And for those who are sponsorship agreement holders or working with sponsorship agreement holders, keep in mind, sponsoring Blended Visa Office referred refugees does not require any of your allocations the spots that you are given for sponsoring refugees each year. The Rainbow Refugee Assistance Program, RRAP, is also a cost-sharing program between the government and private sponsors for sponsoring lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirited, and others who are being persecuted because of gender identity. The government provides startup costs and 3 months of financial support. And the sponsors provide the remaining 9 months of financial support, as well as 12 months of settlement assistance, which includes emotional and social support. The Rainbow Refugee Society, in collaboration with sponsorship agreement holders, is responsible for submitting all applications under this partnership. And again, sponsorship under this particular program does not require any SAW allocations. When it comes to the Joint Assistance Sponsorship Program, this is a program for refugees with special needs that require extra support, such as disabilities, victims of torture and suffering from severe trauma, or refugees who have very large families. This program is fully funded by the government, so there is no financial cost to the private sponsors. Initially, the refugees are provided with settlement support by the government-funded Resettlement Assistance Program through service-providing organizations. When it comes to government-assisted refugees, GARs, these are refugees identified to the Government of Canada by UNHCR, and these refugees are government-funded. And settlement support is provided by settlement-providing organizations under the government-funded Resettlement Assistance Program, so that GAR's program does not involve private sponsors at all. Now we're going to talk about the types of sponsorship groups. So in learning about the different sponsorship group types, you should have come to an understanding that sponsoring a refugee is to be done by a group of people. A single individual cannot solely sponsor a refugee under the PSR program. In this module, you would have learned that there are 3 categories of sponsorship groups: sponsorship agreement holders, groups of 5, and community sponsors. Now, sponsorship agreement holders are commonly referred by the acronym SAWs. And these are incorporated organizations who have been incorporated for at least 2 years that intend to sponsor multiple refugees each year and have signed an agreement with the Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. Now, a variety of organizations become SAWs, including faith-based organizations, humanitarian organizations, newcomer settlement agencies, and others with a specific focus, like Rainbow Refugee, World University Services of Canada, and Danby Products Limited. There are currently over 140 SAWs throughout Canada, excluding Quebec, of course, and the majority are located in Ontario. You can find a list of these organizations on the canada.ca website. Now, it's important to note that SAWs have a limited allocation on how many refugees they can sponsor each year. So if you reach out to a sponsorship agreement holder to get help to sponsor a refugee, and they tell you that they have reached their allocation or cap for this year, what this means is that they have filled all the spaces they were assigned for being able to submit sponsorships for that year. Each SAW will receive a new allocation, typically by February or March in a given year. Keep in mind, however, that most SAWs have long waiting lists already, which is why it's often difficult to find one to partner with. Now, sponsorship agreement holders often work with constituent groups and or co-sponsors. These are groups of people or maybe a couple of people related to the refugee that have been authorized by a SAW to sponsor their relatives under its agreement. And each SAW works differently. So how they manage their constituent groups and how they interact with and manage co-sponsors may be different from SAW to SAW, and they have the freedom to do so. They do all, however, have to follow the guidelines and the instructions provided to them from IRCC, and they have to meet all of the necessary requirements from their agreement as well with the Government of Canada. When it comes to groups of 5, this is 5 or more Canadian citizens, permanent residents, or status Indians who are over the age of 18 and who live in the same residential community where the refugee is expected to settle. The group should have enough money and helping hands on their team to carry out the settlement commitment for 12 months of sponsorship. Keep in mind that you're not limited to just 5 persons who can sign the undertaking document. Groups of 5 means it's a minimum of 5 people, but you can certainly have more than 5 people agreeing to come together to sponsor a refugee. However, groups of 5 can only sponsor those refugees who have a refugee status determination document. Now, when it comes to community sponsors, these are any organization, association, or corporation, and they do not have to be incorporated like the SAWs do. And they don't have a set number of allocations for sponsorships that they can do as a SAW does. But they, like the groups of 5, are limited by only being able to sponsor refugees who have the refugee status determination document. The organization does have to be registered, though, either as a not-for-profit or charity, or it can be a registered business that has nonprofit motivations behind the sponsorship. The organization must have the financial and settlement capacity to fulfill the 12-month sponsorship commitment. So this means that they should have funds in place in advance before the refugee comes for that settlement period, and they should have sufficient people in place for assisting with the settlement activities. The community sponsor group must be located in the community where the refugee is expected to settle. And like sponsorship agreement holders, community sponsorship organizations may also choose to work with co-sponsors, but they can only sponsor refugees who have that RSD document. All of these 3 sponsorship group types must make a commitment to provide that financial support and settlement assistance to the refugee whom they've sponsored after the refugees arrive in Canada, and that is generally for 12 months. That's the end of my review. I wonder if you have any questions that I haven't covered in my review related to Module 2. Yes, they have that responsibility of pre-screening the refugees they're going to submit sponsorships for. That's part of their agreement with IRCC, is that they will do that legwork ahead of time. So essentially, they're doing the same thing that UNHCR would do, is to evaluate whether the refugees meet the refugee definition and whether they are eligible to come to Canada. Yeah, thank you. So your first question related to sponsorship agreement holders. So the agreement they sign with the Government of Canada does not stipulate how much money they must receive from the co-sponsors in advance of submitting an application. But a smart organization will require the full amount or the full cost of sponsorship in advance of submitting an application, and that is for risk management. They have to be assured that the money is in place for settlement, or at least the bulk of it, before they even enter into that undertaking that they are going to do. And that's for their own protection measure, because ultimately, the sponsorship agreement holder is responsible for financially providing for the refugees if their co-sponsors or constituent groups do not live up to the agreement, the contributions that they had intended to make. So if there's any shortfall in the amount of funding when the refugees arrive, the sponsorship agreement holder has to come up with that money. And so that's why there are various differences from SAW to SAW, because one SAW may be financially comfortable enough to say, okay, I trust and believe that this co-sponsor will be able to come up with the amount of money by the time the refugees arrive. So I don't require the full amount up front. I require a percentage up front. And then they expect the co-sponsor or constituent group to continue depositing money into that funds held in trust account up until the date of arrival, till they meet that total amount. Other sponsorship agreement holders don't have the financial trust in their co-sponsors and constituent groups. And it's not necessarily that they don't trust them. It's that they don't feel secure enough to be able to take on that financial responsibility if the co-sponsors or constituent groups don't provide the money they said they would. And so they require the full amount of sponsorship deposited into a bank account up front before they will even submit the application. So there is a variety of requirements that are specific to the SAW itself, the organization, of what they expect. Now, one thing I do need to point out is that in the agreement, sponsorship agreement holders are allowed to request a one-time fee of the co-sponsors for administrative costs. And that one-time fee is $525. So that administrative cost could include helping to pay for their staff who are helping to process the applications, because there's a lot of work involved in reviewing applications and determining if refugees are actually eligible. That's the SAW's responsibility. So that one-time fee of $525 is the maximum amount they can ask from you. If you are aware of a sponsorship agreement holder who is charging you or other people more than that amount, a one-time cost, you do need to inform IRCC and let them know which sponsorship agreement holder that is, because then they are not operating with integrity and they should be identified. Now, as to your second question about community sponsors. So community sponsor groups don't have to be incorporated. But what I would tell you, the scenario you gave me was a single individual, a business owner who basically has a company name, right? Let's say it's a cleaning company. And that individual maybe hires a staff of 10 people who do cleaning for them. Or maybe they don't. Maybe they are the only single cleaning person for their company, but they've registered their company and they are registered in the province. Now, they could try and apply and send an application for community sponsorship, but ultimately IRCC wants to know that with any sponsorship, it's the same, whether it's a group of 5 community sponsor or sponsorship agreement holder. They want to know that you have the funds in place and that you have the number of people in place to support the family when they arrive. And you can't just simply say it in the application, yes, I have this in place. You have to demonstrate it some way. So financially, you have to demonstrate, and the easiest way to do it as a community sponsor is to require that the full amount of sponsorship funds are deposited into a funds held in trust account before the application is submitted. That's the most secure way to demonstrate to IRCC that funds are in place to have that money in advance. It's going to be a little harder if you're a single individual to prove to the Canadian government that you have a team in place for sponsorship, because you don't have any employees and you don't necessarily have any volunteers. So you have to be able to show a sustainable group of people, so people that will remain as part of that organization and accountable to that sponsorship. Because you might be able to get some of your friends to agree, yes, we will help with settlement. But if the refugee doesn't arrive for 5 years down the road, they might not even live near you anymore. So they can't actually be part of the sponsorship anymore. IRCC wants to know that you have a committed team of people with your organization that will still be there when the refugee arrives to help with settlement assistance. So the community sponsorship group is kind of like that in-between space between groups of 5 and sponsorship agreement holders. They operate similarly financially like a group of 5, but they don't have some of the strict policy adherence that sponsorship agreement holders have to have, like being incorporated as an organization for at least 2 years. But certainly you can try to submit an application as a community sponsorship group if you think you can fulfill the application requirements. You can learn about those by looking up the guide, the instruction guide for community sponsorship groups. And that's you can find that information on the RSTP website. So I'm not saying that groups of 5 can't sponsor people with special needs. You certainly can, but it's under the private sponsorship of refugees program. It's not under the joint assistance sponsorship program. Under that program called joint assistance sponsorship. So it's a specific program where the government pays for the settlement of that family, and the government only refers them to sponsorship agreement holders. You're correct. So groups of 5 don't have to put the full amount of money for sponsorship in a funds held in account. You do have to, however, prove that each person who says they're going to contribute funds from their income can actually do so. And the way you prove that is each person has to provide their notice of assessment from Canada Revenue Agency as proof of their income. Now, even though I say that, it is sometimes difficult for groups of 5 who are only pledging from income to get approved because the Government of Canada sees that as a riskier application. If the money's not there already, then they're not as confident that the money will be there when the refugees arrive, potentially in 5 years' time. So I always recommend, where it's possible, rather than just pledging from your income, put money in the bank in a funds held in trust account to secure those funds so they are not used for anything else. So they are available for when the refugees arrive, because things happen in life. You may pledge that you're going to give $10,000 to a sponsorship, but in the course of 5 years' time, maybe you lost your job, or maybe your house had a fire and you're trying to rebuild your own life. Where is that money going to come from for the refugees who are arriving? So it is always a safer scenario for you as a group of 5 to commit to putting the money into an account. Just to summarize, groups of 5, you have 3 options. You could have individuals pledge from their employment income, their sources of income, to sponsor the refugee. Or you could have money deposited into a funds held in trust account, or a combination of both. But I know that IRCC looks at all 3 of those scenarios and says, what is the most secure way for us to know that the refugees will have funds available to them from their sponsors when they arrive? If the money's already in the bank, that's a low risk for them. Yes, I would say that is the safest way for you as the community sponsor organization to operate, that you would require them to deposit the funds up front for the same reasons the sponsorship agreement holder would. So those of you who have an ambition as an organization to become a sponsorship agreement holder, one of the ways you can do that is to build your previous experience as a community sponsorship group. And so put in place the policies and practices that are expected of a sponsorship agreement holder. That way, you're showing through your experience as a community sponsor that you already understand risk management. It's riskier to accept funds when the refugees arrive from a co-sponsoring organization or group of people. It is much more safe and secure to know that the funds are there when the refugees arrive if it's deposited into a funds held in trust account beforehand. How long it takes in months? It varies. There's nothing specific. It's case by case, and it depends on a variety of factors. So one of the factors is the number of people that IRCC has working in Ottawa to process applications that are first submitted. And those staff members have to determine if there's anything missing in the applications that are submitted. Once they review those and an application moves forward. So to get to that stage where they've reviewed it and nothing's missing, that could be 3 months' time from the time you submit it to the time they check for anything missing. After that, depending on where the refugee is located and how many applications are in front of it, been submitted previously, it can take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before the refugee's application will even be looked at. It depends on where they are. So it depends on the processing times for that particular area. And then after that, if they get approved, their interview is done and Canada says, yes, you can come to Canada. Sometimes it can take 6 months to a year to obtain an exit visa from that country of asylum. So truthfully, and as heartbreaking as it is for me to tell you this, it could be in excess of 5 years before a refugee will arrive in Canada. That's the reality. So when we talk about a sponsorship agreement holder application that was submitted, where they're working with a co-sponsor individual, the sponsorship agreement holder ultimately is responsible financially and for the settlement assistance. So if the co-sponsor drops off the map and disappears and is never to be heard from again, the sponsorship agreement holder is under contract with the government to ensure that that refugee's needs are being met. That being said, the sponsorship agreement holder has a legal right to seek compensation from that individual because they signed a contract for that sponsorship. So ultimately, IRCC is going to look to the sponsorship agreement holder to fulfill those financial and settlement needs in the short term. In the long term, that sponsorship agreement holder is going to probably take that person to court to fulfill that obligation that they agreed to, that they signed a contract for. So you are still legally bound. You are still signing a contract as an individual working with a SAW, but the Government of Canada has set this agreement up to ensure that the refugee is not stranded if their co-sponsors disappear. So hopefully that clarifies. One thing I wanted to mention, because you did raise the question initially about a group of 5, and if the financial contributor refuses to meet their contributions, it affects their next sponsorship. Yes, it does, but it also affects the other group members. So you may not be aware of this, but when you're a group of 5 member, whether or not you agree to contribute money for the sponsorship. So, let's say it's a sponsorship where 3 people are contributing money from their employment income. And one of those people lost their job when the refugee arrives. The rest of the group members, whether or not they said, I'm giving money for the sponsorship, they are financially responsible. So the entire group has to bear the weight of that one person who doesn't meet their commitment. So any one person who doesn't meet their commitment, the whole group is responsible because you signed the undertaking. So if you are someone who agrees to help a sponsorship because they come to you and say, don't worry, we're paying for the sponsorship. You don't have to pay anything. We just need you to help drive them to school, their kids to school, and take them to their appointments. That's all we need your help for. Be very cautious when somebody approaches you with that scenario, because if they default, if they don't pay their portion of what they agreed to for the sponsorship, you are still legally responsible to come up with that money as a group. So beware of that. So if it got refused because they were not convinced that the sponsors had the financial or settlement capacity to do the sponsorship. If it got refused at that stage, then certainly you could reapply with a different program. However, if the refugee was refused for grounds of not being eligible or admissible, the only way you can resubmit an application for that refugee is if their specific situation has changed. So let's say they had fled to Afghanistan and IRCC was not convinced that they didn't have a durable solution there, and that's the reason for the refusal. If the refugee was forced to flee Afghanistan because of war and other things that happened, and they're renewed as a refugee somewhere else, let's say they fled to Turkey, then that's a new situation. So certainly if their situation changed, then they could reapply again. But you couldn't sponsor the same refugee who was refused, who is still in the same circumstances they were in when the first application was refused. Well, that concludes our time for this evening. I do hope you are staying on track with your weekly readings and finishing the quizzes. I'm going to share the upcoming dates. So again, November 3rd is when you want to have modules 1 through 4 completed, the quizzes submitted. The 6th is when we'll review the first 4 quizzes from modules 1 through 4. The 1st of December, you will need to have modules 5 through 8 completed, as well as the quizzes submitted. The 4th is when we'll review those 4 quizzes from modules 5 through 8. And the 8th of December is when the final exam is due, and we'll review the final exam on the 10th of December. Again, just as a reminder, if you have any questions related to this course or e-training in general, please do email me at etraining@rstb.ca. Between Monday and Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern, in general, is when I respond to emails. I don't work on the weekends, so if you send me an email on the weekend, I will respond on the Monday. And if you need immediate help for case-specific questions, so you have an application you're working on and you are stuck and you don't know how to move forward, then I suggest you contact the RSTP helpline between Monday and Friday, 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is a toll-free 1-800 number, and you can be connected with a RSTP trainer instantly who can answer your questions or point you in the right direction for getting your questions answered. So thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate you being here with us this evening, and I wish you well in moving on to Module 3, which is this week.